Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss about quantitative research methods. Right. So we're going to cover the following topics. So this discussion will help you identify what specific scenarios are appropriate for quantitative research methods. So the following topics will be covered. So we're going to talk about educational research in general, and then we're going to talk about quantitative methods as we contrast it with qualitative methods, because sometimes in order to understand how quantitative research methods works, we need to understand how it contrasts with its counterpart. So we usually compare qualitative with quantitative research methods, right? So we're also going to talk about how to conduct quantitative research and the specific steps that you need to conduct in order for you to do the quantitative research approach. And then we're going to talk about the three types of research questions in quantitative research. And then after that, we'll talk about the research hypothesis, the null hypothesis, the research design. So that includes experimental and quasi-experimental, how they differ with each other and how are they similar and what makes them really different from each other, right? So we're also going to talk about survey research. This is another form of research design. And very important, as you conduct your research, you'll be having an instrument. And how do you ensure its validity? And what are the different types of validity that you need to take note? All right. So another thing that we need to talk about is the instrument and its reliability. So an instrument should be valid and at the same time reliable. So once this is already prepared, you can now proceed to your sampling. And there are different kinds of sampling designs, although we have actually discussed this in our other videos. However, we're going to have a general classification and how to go about doing sampling. So if you're ready, let's go ahead. Right. So we're going to start with what is educational research. So as defined, educational research is a systematic application of a family of methods that are employed to provide trustworthy information about educational problems. So this is actually from Gay and Aeration 2000. So usually the topics that evolve around educational research revolve around the following. So we have student learning. So what is the best way for a learner to learn? So we ask that question and then we conduct studies and researches about how to improve student learning. We also talk about teaching methods. So what approach is appropriate and what strategy works best, right? So there is still a lot of debate regarding this because we have different kinds of students. So a one-stop shop approach will not work anymore. So we need to really conduct more research about this. And we also talk about how do you maximize teachers' training? So how do we continuously improve teachers' performance? Because as we all know, the quality of education that we have is only as good as the kind of teachers that we have, right? So we also talk about classroom dynamics. So we talk about class size and how to really design your learning environment for you to maximize learning. So these are only few of the possible topics that you can pursue under the new normal or under educational research. If you want to know more about topics that you can conduct under the new normal, I also have another video regarding that one. So all the possible topics that you can conduct in the field of education, especially here in the Philippines, are found in the link above. All right, so you can also check my channel for you to see the other videos related to research. Right, so we also have, if we contrast qualitative research from quantitative research methods, we're going to see here the general difference. So in qualitative, we try to understand and interpret human perspective. So we look at how a person views a reality itself. And in quantitative, it's quite different because we compare or create correlations about population's attributes. So this is what we usually do, right? So quantitative is more positivist in an approach. So we see that knowledge really exists external from human perspective. But in qualitative, we are very much concerned with how people interpret things, right? So in qualitative, we also have less generalizable to the population. The reason for that is because our study is only applicable to that person that we are studying or to the current population that we are studying. However, for quantitative research methods, we are really looking for the ability to generalize to the whole population. So we take out a sample, study it, and then we generalize, make predictions, inferences, or calculations as to what kind of population we have. And then we also have in qualitative research, we have rich descriptions. It's really in depth, as you can see there, and then it's only a small sample. But in quantitative, we have numerical summaries. We use numbers, we use quantities, and we cover more, right? So there is breadth. So we cover more people, we cover more respondents as much as possible, and then we have this one, what you call large sample. So there is also a selection of procedures to establish trust in the findings. So that's how we establish validity in qualitative research. We establish procedures and then we document it properly. But in quantitative research, we establish reliability and validity so that we can establish the trust in our findings. So we try to validate the instrument and establish the validity of the research itself and the reliability of the measurements we have conducted. So this is how qualitative and quantitative research methods really differ, right? So let's now proceed to the specific steps. So if you're conducting a quantitative research method, this is usually the steps that you need to conduct. So first of all, you need to identify the problem. So you need to read more of the literature. You try to identify the gap, or it could be rooted from the issues you experience in the field. So that is also a good starting point. So again, in our channel, you can actually see their possible topics that you can pursue under the new normal. So the link is found above. After doing that, after identifying the problem, you can now proceed to, you can pose a research question. So once you have established the reason why you need to conduct the study, you need to establish what can you accomplish out from the research problem that you have. So after doing this, after being clear, you again revisit the literature. So you try to see what prior literature has been done. So try to attempt to answer your problems you have encountered by searching the literature again and looking at how researchers has solved that similar problem. So what has been done? How could your research address the identified gap? So, just to establish that the problem that you have identified is researchable, you need to make sure that that question hasn't been answered, most probably in the context that you have, and try to answer the problems there and try to see how they solve their problems. So that will actually help you in identifying how to go about conducting your research since you have a similar problem. So after doing that, you can also construct the hypothesis. So this is a very important step in quantitative research method. After searching the literature, you try to identify the variables that are important and then look at your research questions that you have established. And then review a prior research construct of your hypothesis and try to predict the relationship between the study variables. So after doing that, after creating your hypothesis, one of the very important step that you need to remember while doing or creating the hypothesis is that the abstract ideas or the variables that you have identified are now measurable. So in a hypothesis, everything is operationalized and everything is measurable as much as possible. For example, intelligence is measured through tests and etc. Right? And also choose a research design or method. So under this, you choose the appropriate research design or method to test the hypothesis. So these choices should be aligned with the previous research as to how they address similar questions as to what you're currently conducting. So remember, in step 2, we try to look at how they are, in step 2 and step 1, we try to look at how literature is being, we look at similar studies. So at this point, it will become very vital that you try to check on the research methods that they have conducted. And if it's a similar problem with you, you can actually adopt the research approaches or methods that they have done in solving the research questions that they have identified. So this makes your research study really valid in a sense that the previous researchers or scientists has already looked at this and they have conducted it in a similar way. One of the very important feature of quantitative research method is that the steps are usually very established already. So you need to stand at the shoulder of the giants and try to understand how they go about solving problems like this. And then after doing that, you do your you apply the methods that you have identified, which you find really credible and really valid, and then draw conclusions out from it. In order for you to do this, you need to apply appropriate analytical methods in order to draw accurate inferences or conclusions that answer the research questions. Speaking of research questions, there are usually three types of questions. Questions usually are descriptive. So under descriptive, you just actually describe the variable that you're focusing into. So for example, perceptions, attitude, achievement. So you try to make it measurable through an instrument or a Likert scale perhaps that will measure the amount of perception or the kind of perceptions that they have, the attitude that they have on the subject that you're researching, or the amount of achievement. So it is usually measured through tests, right? So when you do descriptive questions, your point is just to describe or to quantify whatever you want to measure, right? So in number two, the second kind of research question that you can ask is what you call relational. So this addresses a relationship between two or more variables. For instance, X variable has a linear relationship with Y variable. So one of the things that you need to take note under relational questions is that you cannot really establish a causal relationship between the two variables. Yes, there could be a linear relationship between them. Linear means that if the other variable increases, the other one increases too. And if the other one decreases, the other one decreases too. So there's a kind of pattern or relationship between the two. However, you cannot assume that the X variable causes the Y variable to change. You cannot really conclude it that way. So an example of this is doing some correlational, statistical test in your data. So another one, which is the highest level, is the causal. So this type of question allows the researcher to draw a causal inference. So when you say causal, the other one influences really or causes the other one to change. So for instance, an X variable has an effect to Y variable, or the Y variable causes the X variable to move or to increase or to decrease. So the highest level is really causal, and you need to apply really specific statistical sophisticated methods in statistics in order for you to draw a causal relationship between the variables that you have. So hopefully in this channel, we'll be talking about the different research methods or the statistical tests or methods you can apply in order for you to do this, right? And then we'll talk about the research hypothesis. Okay, so the research hypothesis is actually based from your research questions. So as you can see here, the research questions will be the basis for creating your hypothesis. So whatever questions you have, you try to quantify it. So the hypothesis is a predicted answer to your research problem that it incorporates the operational definitions of the research variables. So this should be rooted from literature. For instance, you try to predict what is the possible answer to your question. For example, is there a direct relationship? We'll have an example of hypothesis later on. So you try to predict the answer to your question. Let's say, for example, the other one really affects the other variable, or X affects the other variable. And then your definitions or your hypothesis should be operational. The key word here is operational. And what does operational mean? It means that you convert whatever variable you're interested into something that is measurable. Right? So much as a concept such as intelligence. Intelligence is really very abstract, right? When you say the intelligence of a person is directly related to perhaps their ability to become a good employee. These are very abstract concepts like intelligence and being a good employee. How do you measure that? So that's the question we need to ask. If you are capable of answering the question, how do you measure that? Then you are now converting intelligence into an operationalized form. How do we convert intelligence to operationalized form? We actually do that every now and then as a teacher, right? So how do you measure learning from our learners? Then we conduct a test. We ask questions, and then we try to quantify it. So there's a score afterwards. So that score is a representation of the intelligence or the learning of the child. However, we need to take note that that measurement is not really 100% accurate because of specific constraints in, in conducting your test. Are you sure that the test is valid, right? Does it really cover the whole intelligence or measure of intelligence of the child? Well, we really can't do that. So, those are issues you need to consider. So, but however, you should base it from literature. As you can see here, it should be rooted from literature. How you convert specific abstract ideas such as intelligence, being an outstanding employee, how do you convert that? There could be a performance rating score for that employee, right? So that score that you have is now the operationalized version of the performance of the employee. So as you can see here, matches a concept such as intelligence with a measurement method or tool such as a survey or scale. So you need to convert everything into numbers, right? So we also have operationalizing your concepts makes your hypothesis testable, right? So why do we need to convert it? The answer to that is because we want our variables, the abstract concepts that we had, turn into something operational so that we can do hypothesis testing. So as we convert it into a number that represents the abstract idea that we want to measure, then that makes our hypothesis now testable. And now we can perform the quantitative research methods that we want to perform. Right? So I hope that's clear. When you say hypothesis, that's the reason why we need to create a hypothesis. And in the act that you create your hypothesis, it should be clear that the variables that you are measuring are now operationalized. So we'll now talk about the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is very important because it assumes that there are no direct relationship between the variables that we have. So the relational and the causal research question relies on the creation of the null hypothesis. So every time we do some relational and causal research question, we create this what you call null hypothesis. So this is the version of the hypothesis that predicts that there is no relationship or causal effect between the variables. I think you have heard of the saying, innocent unless proven guilty. So that's a very important point here when you conduct your research. As a researcher, you need to assume that there is no effect as to the variables that you have. So that is the importance of null hypothesis, right? So as to be more objective with your research, you need to assume that there is no significant difference or significant causal effect or relationship among your variables. So we call this one null hypothesis. And the reason for this is because we want to establish objectivity in how we conduct our research method, especially in quantitative research methods. So as you can see, a sample of null hypothesis, it says here, usually it's represented as HO. There will be no significant difference in critical thinking skills as measured by Watson-Glaser critical thinking test between students whose teacher use collaborative learning strategies and those whose teachers do not. So let's try to take note of two things. Number one, the thing that we want to measure is really critical thinking skills. However, the hypothesis is now operationalized. So that makes it a real hypothesis. Is as mentioned there, as measured by Watson-Glaser critical thinking test. So we already have a very specific measure as to how to measure critical thinking. Remember, critical thinking is a very abstract idea, right? So how can you measure critical thinking? It's inside the brain, right? So, but you are measuring it using a test. And that test is what you call Watson-Glaser critical thinking. That is now a form of an operationalized a form of measurement for critical thinking. So that is the reason why this is a valid hypothesis. And it says no significant difference. So you're assuming that there is no relationship or causal effect among the variables. So that makes this a null hypothesis. You also have what you call a research alternative hypothesis. So under this, there will be significant differences in critical thinking skills as measured by Watson-Glaser critical thinking test. So this is the alternative. So once the null hypothesis is not accepted or it's rejected, then you can use the alternative hypothesis. Again, the purpose of this is to establish objectivity in your conduct of research. So the steps that you conduct in statistical tests is really rooted as to the null hypothesis. You are assuming that there is no relationship between the variables that you are studying in order for you to establish that objectivity, right? So let's now proceed to the next, research design. So this is one of the most important aspect. You are done with your hypothesis, you're done with your question, and this time you need to try to see how you can answer the hypothesis that you have by designing a research that will address the questions that you have. So again, this is designed to create a situation in which the hypothesis can be tested and the research questions answered. So the beauty of research design is that there are a lot of research designs already in place. But again, the research design that you create or you choose, usually in quantitative research methods, this is usually chosen because there are already established methods that you can choose from, right? So you cannot really, as much as possible, you try to adapt instead of creating your own. Because when you create your own, you need to establish the validity and reliability of the steps that you have conducted. But if you have already adapted, a method that has been proven and tested, then there will be less scrutiny to your work because you have adapted a specific method or research design, right? So things to take note. You need to isolate the variables. So that's the first thing you need to do. In quantitative research methods, a lot of variables or what you call intervening variables might affect the results of your test, right? Or the results of your research data gathering. So whatever it is that you're measuring, other variables might get into it. So why do you need to do this? These intervening variables are really affecting the results. So it's very important that you isolate these variables and make sure they are not affecting your results. Again, this is done to ensure that the relationship being tested are caused by the ones that you're really studying, right? Not by other variables included in your study. So just take note of that, and that's a very important thing that you need to remember under research design, right? So we will now proceed to two of the main research designs that you can conduct. So a very common is the experimental and the quasi-experimental research designs. So quantitative research designs may fall to these two broad categories. So we have heard about experimental research, right? So usually under experimental research, there is what you call a control group, wherein there is no treatment given to this group. And then we also have a treatment group. So the treatment group will receive a slightly different variable, which is called the independent variable that you want to test. For example, you want to test the effectivity of a medicine to a specific group of people. So you create a group, which is the control group, who will not receive that medicine or perhaps will receive a placebo, or a version of the pill which is not really, it's just made out of sugar or any chemical, but it doesn't have any effect to the person. And then the other one will receive the real medicine. So that's now the treatment group. So that is a form of experimental research. And one of the number one characteristic of experimental research is that there is a random assignment to groups. For example, you have a population that you want to test. Any of them can actually join the control or the treatment group. They are not grouped ahead of time. They are not people belonging to a certain group. You really do random sampling and then random assignment for each of the members of the group. So each one of them has the chance to belong to either the control or the treatment group. This is to ensure that, specific differences between their characteristics will not affect the result, right? So this is in contrast with quasi-experimental designs, because in quasi-experimental designs, there is, you take advantage of existing groups. This is very common among teachers. When you conduct your experiment to your students, usually they're already arranged according to sections. So this is section 1, section A, B, C, D. So, you already have these existing groups already. And then because of that, because there are already existing groups, there's no random assignments anymore. So you did not randomly assign them to any of the groups that you have. So there is no random assignment, right? So another feature of quasi-experimental design is because you may actually use only one group. So there's no control group or positive control or negative control. You only have one group. So usually we do this using pre-test. There's a pre-test and a post-test. In between that, we do some treatment. And then this is actually a form of within subjects design. Sometimes even to the point wherein there's only a post-test given to the learners. So as you can see, it's called a quasi-experimental. It's like saying that it's not a true experimental design, or it's just like an experimental design, but it's not really an experimental design because again of the lack of random assignment and specific constraints or limitations in its results. So you need to take note. Of this. Since there is a lack of random assignment in quasi-experimental design, the researchers should be aware of the threats to validity. You need to be careful with your assumptions and you need to be careful with your conclusions or the inferences that you make, especially in quasi-experimental designs. So we also have survey research. Survey research is another quantitative research method design. In research, we often measure abstract concepts like attitude, their belief, their feelings. So these are very hard to measure. However, you can conduct surveys in order to capture these hard to measure variables. So what do you do with a survey? So you create an instrument that will try to measure the abstract ideas or these concepts that we have mentioned a while ago that includes attitudes, beliefs, and feelings, right? So this is usually self-reported information. So it is the person himself or herself which supplies the information, right? So regarding this variable, so they self-evaluate, they try to look at how they feel, and then they try to answer it on their own, right? So results will become numerical, although these are very abstract concepts like attitude. How do you measure attitude? But we have found a way to measure all these, even beliefs, and we have used what you call survey research. And usually this is in a form of numerical data, right? So we have sample survey items here, right? So how, for example, you want to measure how confident you are. Confidence is a very abstract idea, but you want to measure or have at least a numerical value as to how confident you are to the information that you have learned. So you can say you can grade 1 for very confident, somewhat confident, or not sure. So you can choose among these numbers here. So if you are not really very confident, you can grade it 5, right? So another form is that which of the following strategies are likely to use in teaching. So you have some certain choices there, so you can choose among those, and you see the specific beliefs or feelings of the people as to which one of these strategies is more useful, or perhaps in the question the following strategies are more likely to be used. So it shows us the probability of in the perspective the person which one has higher probability of being used as a strategy in teaching. Okay, so that is what happens under survey research, right? So once you conduct you can never do your survey research without having an instrument. So you need to have an instrument. So a while ago you have witnessed the research questions. So the research question is considered, as you can see here, this is an example of an instrument. So there are only 2 questions here that they have asked. So this is a form of a survey question instrument. This is an instrument for survey research. Before you can conduct this kind of survey research, you need to be aware that you need to test the validity of the instrument that you're using, right? So there are many types of validity. We have 5 validity types of validities here. So first of all is face validity. So does the face appear in value to measure what's it designed to measure? So face validity really is how it looks like, and is it appropriate to the eyes, to how does it look, right? So these are also important in conducting your research because people aesthetics are also important. Is the format clear, right? So is the font clear, or will the person be able to really appreciate or answer it correctly? Is the grammar consistent so that the person who is reading it will understand what you're trying to mean? So those are under face validity, right? So another very important form of validity for your instrument is content validity. So under content validity, this includes item validity and sampling validity. So these are two items that we need to take note under content validity. So item validity ensures that the individual test items deal only with the subject being addressed. So, if you want to measure something, is it really just about the thing that you're measuring? So it should be only about that. So that is item validity, right? So another thing is sampling validity. It ensures that the range of item topics which is appropriate to the subject being studied is covered. So you can ensure this validity by inviting experts in the field to review the instrument. So item validity is different from sampling validity in a sense that item validity focuses on does the questions really capture what you want to capture, right? But for example, under sampling validity, the question this time is were you able to cover everything that you need to cover under the thing that you want to measure? For you to really understand it, let's say for example, um, very common is really wanted to measure the amount of learning of our students. In order for you to understand it, imagine that you're a teacher. You have done your discussion for a specific topic or chapter, right? So after doing that, you wanted to check how much learning they had, right? But when you did your examination or assessment, you asked questions that were not really included in your discussion, right? So you have already failed in terms of item validity. You know why? Because you have covered, your questions are not really appropriate for the subject that you want to measure, for the learnings you want to measure in this situation, right? So, but let's say, for example, you're conducting this test. Afterwards, you want to conduct the test, and then you only covered the test questions, did not really cover the whole or the extent of your discussion that you have done, right? So you have already failed in terms of sampling validity because the range of items or topics that should be covered in your test in order to measure their full amount of learning was not covered, right? Because there were specific tests or test questions under your examination that did not cover the things that you have discussed during your lesson. So it's very important that you consider content validity, right? So let's also talk about concurrent validity. So does the new test correlate with an older established test but measures the same thing? So there are many exams that are called standardized, right? So if you have this concurrent validity, it means that your instrument is really very valid. So you need to correlate your results with an older established test, right? But usually this is not really included in most of the research. However, if you include this one, this really establishes a lot of validity and confidence as to your instrument. Then we have predictive validity. So does the test correlate with another related measure? Okay, you can use linear regression to establish the predictive validity of the test. All right, so we also have construct validity. So does the test measure the construct it is intended to measure? This could be difficult if the constructs being measured are abstract, but it can be established by conducting a number of studies in which the test hypothesis regarding the construct or by completing a factor analysis. The construct that you wanted to measure includes, for example, intelligence, right? So that is a very abstract idea. To ensure that there is construct validity, you can conduct more research regarding this one and then test your hypothesis regarding the construct by completing a factor analysis, right? So concurrent validity, predictive validity, and construct validity are usually not included in establishing your research validity. However, face validity and content validity are really very important factors that you need to be validated, right? So let's proceed now to another very important factor, which is instrument reliability. So a while ago, we talked about validity, and this time reliability is different from validity in a sense that here, this time, we talk about consistency, right? So does our instrument consistently measure the same thing consistently, even in a different setting? We call this one reliability. So in addition to ensuring the validity of the instruments, any quantitative researcher needs to establish the reliability of the instrument being used. So the the four approaches that you can see there talks about instrument reliability. So what do you do? Let's say, for example, you have a test instrument, right? So you can test it once and then do another test, right? Of the same people. You need to do it at the same people. Okay? So if you do that, you try to check if their scores are consistent. So if they are not consistent, or there is a great difference between the test one and then the other test, or the retest, then therefore the instrument is not really reliable at all, right? So another form of doing this is that you create another test, but this time you rearrange, change the structure, or find a similar test, and then do it in the same person, right? Or the same set of people, right? So we have test one and test two, or we call it the alternate forms. Or it's just this, it's just a way of saying that you have two test papers, but they are really similar and they are actually equivalent in a sense. So you conduct them into same set of people, and then we have what you call alternate forms. Right? So another form of doing this is that you just do the split half. So the split half is you divide the test questionnaire that you have, or the instrument that you have, into two parts, right? So the other part and the other part, and then you try to check the consistency, the internal consistency of the test that you have. All right. So another form of doing this, which is the most common and the most known, is the Cronbach alpha. So what really happens in Cronbach alpha is that it will test all the possible split half, right? So all the possible split halves in, let's say for example, you have 10 items. So you have item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, up to 10. So each of the items, all the possible split half, or if you divide all the items, one, all the odd numbers or the even numbers, and this time you skip 3 times, and then compare all those possible split half, then you have what you call the Cronbach alpha. So this is usually the one that we measure in terms of doing internal consistency of the instrument that we have. Okay, so that's for reliability, and then we'll proceed now to sampling. So after ensuring that the instrument is valid and reliable, you need to rely this time to administering the instrument to representative sample. So in doing this, it's very important that you choose a sample that will represent the population. So I think if we just sum up everything in under sampling, you need to take note that whatever you do in sampling, getting a small portion of the population and studying it, hopefully the items or the samples that you have collected will represent the whole population. Okay, so there are two strategies in doing this. The first one is random sampling, all right, and the other one is random sampling. So under random sampling, let me just emphasize that random sampling is really the way to go for quantitative research methods because it is more valid. Okay, so there are many kinds. You have simple, just randomly select everything, right? So all the items will be given equal chance of being selected. And then we also have systematic sampling. So under systematic sampling, just arrange them into grids or table, and then consistently choose a specific row wherein that will be included in your sample. Stratified is more sophisticated in a sense that you try to group them according to their characteristic and then equally get samples from all those groups, right? So stratified and cluster are very similar, but cluster is more geographical in a sense. So you group them in their geographical location, right? Their location in space, and then you try to represent each of the clusters as much as possible. Equal representation as to the different characteristics that you have identified, right? So that is a random sample. So random sampling is really something that is a go-to for quantitative research methods. And for non-random, this is usually used for qualitative research methods. So convenience, you just try to see which one of them are closest to you, and then the closest to you will be the one that you will get as a sample. Quota sampling is more like you set a specific number of samples that you want to collect, and once you reach that quota, you can stop, right? So purposive sampling is that you purposely choose a specific sample that will be of interest to your research. Snowball, on the other hand, is more like looking at someone very close to you first and then getting referrals from that person. It's like a snowball, because a snowball, when it rolls from the mountain, it becomes bigger and bigger, right? So as you collect more, or you start with convenient sampling, and then as you collect more information, you ask referrals, and then you have this more set of samples that you can have, right? So again, let me emphasize that if you want to do sampling, you need to take note. The general idea here is that it should be a representative sample, so that everything you conclude about your population is valid because it represents the whole population. Okay, so just be aware of that, and whatever you do, make sure you put that in your mind. Okay, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something. On the next video, we'll talk about qualitative research data analysis that you can conduct using quantitative research methods. So don't forget to subscribe and comment in the comment section your request for more videos, and your messages of thanks will be deeply appreciated. So again, thank you so much for watching, and God bless.